July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson collapsed from a heart attack while eating breakfast. He was 62 years old. 3 days later, his funeral drew thousands. Politicians, jazz musicians, community leaders. And standing in the back, trying not to be noticed, was Frank Lucas. Frank hadn't been seen in Harlem for 3 years. Most people thought he was dead. But there he was, waiting until everyone else had paid their respects. Then he walked up to the casket, knelt down, and whispered something that nobody else could hear, an apology to a dead man for something that happened in 1965. Something so devastating that Frank Lucas, who would go on to build a $1 million a day heroin empire, never forgot it. Something that made him run from Harlem for 3 years and only come back when he knew Bumpy Johnson couldn't punish him again. This is the story of what Bumpy did to Frank Lucas, the lesson that even American Gangster was too scared to show. To understand what Frank Lucas whispered at that funeral, you need to go back 3 years, to 1965. To a moment when Frank Lucas made the biggest mistake of his life. Frank Lucas was born in North Carolina in 1930, came to Harlem in 1946, 16 years old with nothing but ambition and anger. He worked his way up through the ranks, numbers running, protection, muscle work. By the early 60s, he was making decent money, but decent wasn't enough. Frank wanted to be rich. He wanted to be powerful. He wanted to be somebody. In 1964, Frank went to Vietnam, not as a soldier, as a businessman. He saw an opportunity that nobody else saw. The war had created a drug pipeline from Southeast Asia to America, and the Italian mafia controlled it all. They bought heroin from suppliers in the Golden Triangle, cut it multiple times, and sold it for massive profits. Frank thought, why pay the middlemen? Why not go straight to the source? He made connections in Thailand, negotiated directly with suppliers, arranged for pure heroin to be smuggled back to the States in the coffins of dead American soldiers. It was bold, it was ruthless, and it was about to make him millions. When Frank got back to Harlem in early 1965, he was ready to revolutionize the drug game. He had the purest product in New York. He could undercut the Italian mob's prices and still make a fortune. He had his territory picked out, 116th Street, right in the heart of Harlem. There was just one problem: Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was 59 years old in 1965. He'd been the king of Harlem for 20 years. He ran the numbers, controlled the protection rackets, settled disputes, and most importantly, he had one unbreakable rule: no hard drugs in Harlem. Bumpy had seen what heroin did to communities. He'd watched it destroy families in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia. He'd seen kids turn into addicts, mothers lose their children, neighborhoods rot from the inside out. And he'd made a promise to Harlem: not here, not in his neighborhood. Everyone who operated in Harlem knew the rule. The Italian mob respected it. They sold heroin everywhere else in New York, but not in Bumpy's territory. Local dealers knew it. Even the police knew it. If you wanted to work in Harlem, you followed Bumpy's rules. But Frank Lucas wasn't interested in rules. He was interested in money. Frank set up his operation quietly. He didn't announce it, didn't advertise, just started moving product through a network of young dealers who were hungry enough to take the risk. Within 2 weeks, Frank was making $50,000 a week. In 1965, that was an unbelievable amount of money. He was selling pure heroin, he called it blue magic, at prices that made the Italian mob's cut product look like a joke. Customers came from all over the city, and word spread fast. It took exactly 12 days for Bumpy Johnson to hear about it. Bumpy didn't storm in with guns, didn't send a message through violence. He did something much more frightening. He invited Frank to lunch. They met at Wells' restaurant, the same place where Bumpy would die 3 years later. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet, just the two of them at a corner table. Bumpy ordered breakfast food, even though it was 2 p.m. Frank ordered coffee, too nervous to eat. "I hear you've been busy," Bumpy said, cutting into his eggs. Frank tried to play it cool. "Just trying to make a living, Mr. Johnson." "Making a living is fine, Frank. I respect that. But you're selling heroin on 116th Street, in my neighborhood." "It's good business," Frank said. "People want it. I'm just providing a service." Bumpy set down his fork. His voice stayed calm, but something in his eyes changed. "Frank, I'm going to give you some advice, and I'm only going to say this once. Stop selling that poison in Harlem. Take your business to Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, I don't care, but not here. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, that's the old way of thinking. This is the future. This is your first warning," Bumpy interrupted. "I'm giving it to you out of respect for the work you've done. You're a smart kid. Don't make me give you a second warning." Frank should have listened. Any other man in Harlem would have listened. But Frank Lucas was 35 years old, making more money than he'd ever seen, and convinced he was smarter than everyone else. He kept selling. 2 weeks later, Bumpy called Frank again. Same restaurant, same table. But this time, Bumpy wasn't polite. "I told you to stop." "Mr. Johnson, I hear you. I respect you. But this is business. I'm not hurting anybody. People are gonna buy drugs whether I sell them or someone else does. At least I'm keeping the money in the community." That last line was a mistake. Bumpy's jaw tightened. "Keeping the money in the community," Bumpy repeated slowly. "Frank, do you know what heroin does? It doesn't just hurt the person using it. It destroys families. It turns mothers into addicts who can't take care of their children. It turns young men into thieves and killers. It hollows out neighborhoods from the inside. That's not keeping money in the community. That's burning the community down for profit." "That's their choice," Frank said. "I'm not forcing anybody. You're feeding poison to people who don't know better, and you're doing it in my neighborhood." "Your neighborhood?" Frank's voice had an edge now. "With all respect, Mr. Johnson, you don't own Harlem. Times are changing. The old rules," Bumpy said quietly, "are the only reason you're still breathing right now." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Is that a threat?" "No, Frank. It's your last warning. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Frank Lucas walked out of that restaurant convinced Bumpy Johnson was finished, too old, too soft, too stuck in the past to understand that the game had changed. Frank went back to 116th Street and doubled his operation. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in unnecessary violence. He believed in precision, in knowing exactly where to apply pressure to make a system collapse. Frank Lucas's operation depended on several key elements: suppliers, transportation, distributors, protection, and most importantly, trust. If any one of those elements disappeared, the whole thing would fall apart. Bumpy decided to make them all disappear. It started on a Monday morning. Frank's main heroin supplier in Thailand was a man named Chen Lee. Chen had a son studying at Columbia University in New York. The son had a gambling problem. He owed money to several bookies who worked for Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy made one phone call. Within 24 hours, all of Chen Lee's son's gambling debts were forgiven, completely erased, as a gift, with a message: "Bumpy Johnson is a friend of your family." When Chen Lee heard this, he understood immediately. This was a warning disguised as a favor. Bumpy was saying, "I can reach your family anytime I want. I can help them or hurt them. Choose wisely." Chen Lee stopped taking Frank's calls. On Tuesday, Bumpy handled the transportation issue. Frank was smuggling heroin in coffins of dead soldiers being flown back from Vietnam. It was a brilliant, terrible scheme, but it required cooperation from several people: military officials, mortuary workers, customs agents, people who were being paid off. Bumpy didn't try to pay them more. He didn't threaten them. He just made sure they understood something simple. The FBI was watching Frank Lucas. Not actively investigating yet, just watching, and anyone connected to his operation would eventually be connected to a federal case. Bumpy had a friend in the bureau, an agent named Turner who'd grown up in Harlem. Turner didn't leak classified information. He just started asking questions, casual questions. "You know anything about Frank Lucas? We've been hearing his name." That was all it took. The military officials, the mortuary workers, the customs agents, they all stopped cooperating. The risk wasn't worth it anymore. By Wednesday, Frank couldn't get product into the country. On Thursday, Bumpy destroyed Frank's distribution network. Frank's dealers were young, hungry, and loyal to money, not to Frank. Bumpy sent his people to have conversations with each dealer. Not threats, just information. "You know Frank's supplier disappeared, right? You know the feds are asking about Frank. You know Frank's not going to be able to protect you when this all falls apart." Some dealers quit immediately. Others tried to hold out, but when they saw their colleagues walking away, they followed. Within 48 hours, Frank didn't have a single person willing to sell for him. By Friday, the money started disappearing. Frank had stash houses all over Harlem, apartments where he kept cash, product, weapons. He'd been careful. Only his most trusted associates knew the locations, but Bumpy knew people. He knew landlords, building superintendents, neighbors who paid attention, and he knew how to ask questions without asking questions. Bumpy's people didn't rob Frank's stash houses. They didn't break in. They didn't need to. They just made sure the right information got to the right people. Information about lease violations, fire code issues, suspicious activity that needed to be investigated. Within a week, police had raided 3 of Frank's locations, not because they were targeting Frank specifically, but because anonymous tips had forced them to act. The cash and drugs were confiscated as evidence. Frank couldn't even claim it without incriminating himself. By the following Monday, exactly a week after Bumpy had started, Frank Lucas's entire operation was gone. No suppliers, no transportation, no dealers, no money, no protection. And Bumpy Johnson hadn't fired a single shot, hadn't thrown a single punch, hadn't made a single direct threat. Frank Lucas sat in his apartment on Tuesday morning, staring at the phone. None of his people were answering. His supplier in Thailand had vanished. His dealers had disappeared. His stash houses were empty. He had $3,000 in his pocket. A week ago, he'd had hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now he had enough for a bus ticket. There was a knock on his door. Frank grabbed the gun from his nightstand, approached cautiously. "Who is it? Delivery." Frank opened the door. A young kid, maybe 16, stood there with an envelope. "This is for you, Mr. Lucas." Frank took the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with one sentence written in neat handwriting. "You're still breathing. That's your only warning. Leave." No signature, but Frank knew who it was from. That night, Frank Lucas packed a bag, got in his car, and drove south. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. He ended up in North Carolina, back where he'd started. He laid low, worked odd jobs, and tried to figure out what had happened. How had Bumpy Johnson destroyed everything without ever confronting him directly? How had an old man with outdated ideas demolished a sophisticated drug operation in less than a week? It took Frank 3 years to understand. Bumpy didn't win because he was more violent. He won because he understood something Frank didn't. Power isn't about what you control, it's about what you're connected to. And Bumpy Johnson was connected to everything and everyone in Harlem. Frank Lucas stayed away from Harlem for 3 years. He heard news occasionally. Bumpy was still running things. The neighborhood was stable. No heroin epidemic like in other cities. Bumpy's rule held. Then, on July 7, 1968, Frank got a phone call. Bumpy Johnson was dead. Frank drove up from North Carolina for the funeral. He stayed in the back, watched hundreds of people pay their respects to a man who'd ruled Harlem not through fear, but through respect and intelligence. When the crowd thinned, Frank walked up to the casket. He looked at Bumpy's face, peaceful now, and thought about that lunch at Wells' restaurant, the warnings he'd ignored, the lesson he'd learned. Frank knelt down and whispered, "I'm sorry. You were right. I was a fool." Nobody else heard it, but Frank needed to say it. After Bumpy's death, Frank Lucas came back to Harlem. He rebuilt his drug empire, became one of the most powerful dealers in America, made millions, but he never forgot what Bumpy taught him. He never sold in schools, never targeted kids, always kept some code, some sense of rules. When Frank was finally arrested in 1975, when he sat in prison thinking about his life, he told his lawyer something interesting. "The only man I ever truly feared was Bumpy Johnson, not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. He could destroy you without you ever seeing it coming." That's the lesson Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas in 1965. Power isn't about violence, it's about knowing the system so well that you can take it apart piece by piece, quietly, efficiently, without anyone realizing what's happening until it's too late. Frank Lucas became famous. There were books about him, movies about him, but the story they never told was the one Frank whispered at a funeral. The story of how Bumpy Johnson made him disappear for 3 years with nothing but intelligence, connections, and one simple principle: no poison in Harlem. Look, if this story showed you a different side of power, the smart side, the strategic side, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more Bumpy Johnson stories, because we've got plenty more where this came from. Drop a comment. Was Bumpy right to chase Frank out of Harlem, or should he have let him operate? And make sure you hit that notification bell, because next week we're telling the story of how Bumpy walked into a 5 families meeting unarmed and walked out alive. You're not going to want to miss that. Remember, the most dangerous man in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who knows exactly which thread to pull to make everything unravel.